Hey guys, so while we are in the process, in this first unit, the goal is um, just to kind of go over some introductory stuff, get sort of situated as a writer and a researcher in this class, um, and also kind of wrap your head around what your topic might be for this inquiry project. Again, the goal is to be decided at the end of this unit, at which time you're sort of, stuck with the topic that you have. You can make some little tweaks, obviously, but if you're researching something about standardized testing and your research kind of goes in a different direction, you could tweak it like within that issue a little bit, but you couldn't switch from you don't want to switch from standardized testing to stem cell research because then you have to start the project all over again. And at that point, we're well underway. So really try to be thinking about what you might want to do. And again, like we've been making like some brainstorming lists of topics with Studio One. The goal is to cast a wide net and throw out a lot of different sources of reading and ideas and opinions and things to help get people started. So we're actually gonna kind of start here. You just did a little bit of work with kind of thinking about some of the places you go first when you are researching, whether it's for school or kind of on your own. Like, where are the places that you go first? And the most common one that I hear is Wikipedia. So we're going to be talking about that over the next couple of weeks and some of those kinds of sources and how we might use them. We're today going to start kind of talking about research at what I consider to be the very first step. One is when you go to your first set of Google results, which is typically where people go first. Like the internet, do a Google search, especially if you don't know anything about the issue, right? That's typically where we do go first. And we end up at Wikipedia because it's the first that pops up. It's at the top of the list, So today we're going to be talking about the CRAP test, which is something we're going to use throughout this semester as a way to sort of critically evaluate sources that you're coming across, and also how to recognize what I consider to be sources that really shouldn't even be in the conversation. Like, there are a lot of sources. There's a huge spectrum of credibility for things that are going to be in your conversation. You are going to come across things that are super credible and things that are by scholars and things that are by journalists and things that are firsthand accounts and things that have bias, and they're all part of the conversation except for these sources. And that's kind of what we're going to start with. Okay, so the first thing is recognizing content farms, or really bad sources. So in order to do that, we're going to introduce the CRAP test, which is going to help you determine the level and type of crap you are reading. I'm going to make a lot of crap jokes. It's going to get awkward. Okay, so obviously it is an acronym because it sort of spells out, crap. Not to be confused with an initialism like UNC Charlotte, which doesn't actually spell out a word. Sorry, grammar nerd moment. So the first one is currency. So when you're looking at a source, you want to think about how current that source is. A common thing is to, for the page to pull up and look at it and, read through it and say, oh, this sounds interesting, and not pay attention to whether or not this was posted recently or whether this is part of the current conversation. So if you're going back to Burke's Parlor, thinking about whether or not this is from someone who is sitting at the table right now, talking and commenting on current issues, or are you, pulling up something that's old? Because it's kind of bad form to use something and throw out something that's outdated. You want to make sure that if you're talking about the issue now in the current conversation, that you're talking about and using sources that are relevant to right now. So you want to pay attention to when it is. So usually it's either at the top of the article where it has the author's name, or sometimes it's in the last revised or updated part that's at the bottom of the article, kind of in the footer. So just kind of paying attention to, if you're doing something that's a really popular, heavily debated topic right now, then your sources need to be super current. If it's something that like information is changing slowly, it's not as popular of a topic, then the current conversation might go back, 5 years. But it does kind of depend on your issue. So you really have to pay attention to how popular and covered and like how fast moving the information is. And you also kind of want to pay attention to like one things that you can kind of tell if something is really old, like just the page itself, is. And this last thing here, if you're looking at a web source, if you check the links, a lot of times if it's a source that like is older or nobody's using, the links won't be functional, or they'll be broken, or you go to a page and it'll say like error, and the link won't work anymore. So that can be another kind of easy way just to tell if something is not passing the CRAP test. Thing on the list is relevance, so R for relevance. So there's a couple of ways to think about relevance, like how relevant it is to your question. One thing is how in-depth and unique the information is. Something is not super relevant if it's rehashing old or superficial information. Another thing that you might want to think about is whether or not you are looking for something that is representing a particular like group or voice or perspective, or whether you're looking for a certain type of information, you're trying to answer a certain kind of question, and you want to make sure that the source is really not necessarily finding what you wanted to find, but definitely in terms of what it's offering, hitting the nail on the head. An example of something that's not relevant in this sense would be, you went looking up something for some historical context, and you found this article that's huge, but the only part that's relevant is this little bitty, small like subsection. That would be something that's not super relevant or super helpful. So you would want to scratch that and maybe move to something different, obviously paying attention to assignment requirements and that kind of stuff. The other thing is paying attention to whether or not it's referencing other sources, or if it's available elsewhere. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later. Like, for instance, the first essay that you read in your textbook by Megan Rand, she referenced several comedians. If you wanted to quote one of those comedians and you found that quote in Megan's article, you wouldn't want to quote it from Megan's article. Like, you wouldn't want to just find that quote and it's by her. You're not using anything else in Megan's article. You're just using this quote from that comedian. That wouldn't be the best source to use. You would want to go back and find that comedian's book or that comedian's source and use that, because that's the original place it was, and that's what's most relevant to what you're doing. So relevance goes in a lot of different directions, and it can be a little bit tricky. That's something we'll kind of practice with, Authority. I think we pay, oh, sorry, it's kind of jumping around a little bit there. Again, authority is something that goes in a lot of different directions also. Obviously paying attention to who the author or creator or the sponsor is. A lot of times, especially if you're on the internet, you can't always find who the author is of a text, but it's important not just who the name of the author is, it's also important who is behind it. So paying attention to not just this journalist, but what is the political slant of the paper that the news source that they're writing for, or what is the bias of the organization or company that's behind it. So paying attention to author and authority in kind of two different ways there, not just the writer itself, but who is in charge of that writer, and are there any biases there, and does that writer have biases? There should be an author. One of the biggest no's is if you cannot find an author or a publisher or any information about where that source was from. If you're wanting to use a source, and I say where, or someone else in class, if you're working with a group and they say well, where did you get this from, and you say, well, I don't know, that's a huge red flag. You should always be able to, it could have been written by Bob in his basement, and we don't even know who Bob is. You know what I mean? Because just about anybody can write stuff on the internet. So you really have to pay attention to make sure that you can find an author. That's step one. Then evaluating the author and the authority for that author, the news source or the site or the company. Paying attention to that author's specific credibility. If it's like Is it a personal stake that they have? Is it professional? Like, are they like a journalist or news, or this is their, related to their job? Or is it scholarly, in which case, like if they're saying they're an expert in this issue, like, and they're writing as an authority, what have they published? Where have they published? Can you find it? Where are they educated? Is their degree relevant? A lot of times you'll find like sources online, and if you actually read the author bio, it'll say like this person has they're writing about like video games and teens, and their degree is in English. They have a master's degree in English from such and such university. Awesome. What exactly does having a degree in English, like how does having a degree in English qualify you to write about that? I mean, it sounds nice, they have a degree, but it doesn't make them an expert in the thing that they're writing on. So that's a little bit sketchy, and you have to kind of watch out for that. Another thing is kind of paying attention to the domain. I bet a lot of you wrote that you were, in your notebook entry before this, you wrote that you were told to stay away from .com sites. There's a lot of different domains that house a lot of different kinds of sites. There's, the .com, the .edu, which houses like educational stuff. There's the .gov, which is like government websites, .org, organizations, nonprofits, that kind of stuff. You don't need to just stay away from .com sites. I'm going to give you an example. Like you might find news sources. News sources are also like often .com, right? A lot of your news and a lot of your interviews and a lot of your first-hand accounts and all that stuff are going to be .com. What you have to be careful about with .com is that it does in fact stand for commercial, so they're usually selling something. If you go, wish I could zoom out, let me zoom out here. If you go to like CNN.com, so this is where I am, CNN. I'm gonna zoom out a little bit more so you can see the actual, now I guess you can actually see the site here. Maybe I can move it so you can see, there, CNN, there I am. Okay, so I'm on CNN, and you'll notice right at the top is an ad for a blender, because your margarita, it won't make itself. I mean, it won't. The struggle is real, right? You have to pay attention. Like even the stuff that you would typically consider like a source that you might use is also going to be selling things. That's how they support what they're doing and make money to keep themselves in business and all that kind of stuff. But it also makes it a very tricky platform, which is, something we will, talk about a little bit in just a few minutes. And also the other one that you kind of have to watch out for sometimes is, like the .org sites, because they can sometimes have some bias also, because that organization is typically going to give you information that supports what they're talking about. So you really sometimes have to pay attention and kind of verify things on those organization websites as well. So the second A is accuracy. And this is actually, I think this is super tricky. Especially with the way internet and news and everything is today. I think you know what I'm talking about. Really paying attention to how accurate and reliable the information is. So again, kind of paying attention to some easy ways that aren't as tricky to kind of notice with this is, are the sources listed? Can you find references? Can you easily, like if they are really citing like credible specific things, they're gonna want to showcase that and make it really easy for you to verify stuff. So if you notice it's really difficult to find the sources of information, then that's probably on purpose. That's a rhetorical choice. So you want to pay attention to, are the sources listed? Is there a references list or a bibliography? Can you tell where those sources are used? Like, are there links? Has this been reviewed by a panel? A lot of times, especially if you're on like medical sites and things like that, it'll say like it's fact check, or it'll say here is our review process, and you can actually look at like the panel that checks everything and verify them to make sure that information is correct. So sometimes you can also like do your own research and kind of look and like verify things from other sources. Another easy way is to pay attention to like grammar and spelling and that kind of stuff, like correct citations, because that does kind of like, I guess it really does like put a little bit of a hit, a little bit of a dent in their credibility. If they're not doing enough work to like check their grammar and their spelling. It makes me wonder what else they kind of skimmed on, you know what I'm saying? The last thing is purpose. So paying attention to the reason behind that source. Is it there to inform, to teach, to persuade, to sell, to entertain? Because sometimes I can tell you if there's bias. If it's there to inform, things that inform can still be biased, can still kind of have that slant, but maybe less if it's there like, or also to teach, less if it's there to sell you something for sure. Or to persuade you of something, if you can tell like what the goal, what the point is, and whether or not the author has that bias. Sometimes you can tell that the tone or language is biased. Like you can hear the slant, and you can hear sometimes like an overly emotional way of like going at an issue that reveals a bias. So you can tell if the point of view is objective or impartial, if they're actually talking about multiple perspectives or really just focusing on this side is right and this side is wrong without really weighing things fairly. If they're basing things more on facts or opinions. How free of advertising is the website? Typically, the fewer weight and preference that are given to ads, the more trustworthy it is. We'll talk about that a little more in just a minute. Was the CRAP test, and we'll be kind of working with that a little bit all term, and especially as we get into the second unit, we'll really be kind of using that to sort of evaluate the sources that you're finding and kind of practicing with this more and more kind of as we go. A couple of things just to kind of differentiate between what is crap versus what has influence in the conversation. I want to make just a couple of points about how we're going to go at your research from the beginning. First, crappy sources and what is considered crap can come in many shapes and sizes. Each source has to be considered individually. If you remember us talking about all the voices and perspectives that were considered in the video games and violence model that we looked at, there were parents and gamers and teachers and scholars, and some of those you would consider more credible than others. But some of them, like not all sources, can be used for more than just evidence. When you're like really communicating and trying to write a paper, you might be using evidence, but you might also be using sources for examples. You might also be using sources to refute them. If you think about like a lot of biased sources, they have power in the conversation. There might be a documentary that is popular on Netflix and everybody has seen, and if you are really making an argument about and trying to communicate about this issue, your audience is going to expect you to talk about that documentary. Maybe it's biased, maybe it's horrible, but your purpose in that paper wouldn't be to use that documentary as evidence. It might be to break it down and explain why people shouldn't be listening to it. But you have to watch it first. And that's kind of the point, is that we're going to come at it by looking at the whole conversation first, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So determining that it doesn't have scholarly level of credibility doesn't eliminate it as useful, and it doesn't eliminate it, might eliminate it as evidence, but it doesn't eliminate it as potentially useful, and it doesn't eliminate it from the conversation. A lot of times the sources that are biased, they still will help represent or illustrate a set of concerns from a certain perspective, and that might also be a way that you can use it. So evidence is just one thing to think about. So there's a lot of potential for sources in hearing out those voices in the conversation. There's a lot of crap. There's a lot of sources that aren't necessarily the upper level of credibility that are going to be in the conversation, and they're part of the conversation because they are in the conversation. Whether they're good, bad, ugly, biased, they're still in the conversation. People are listening to it, aware of it, talking about it, passing it on. It has power. And part of being a responsible researcher is to hear out that whole conversation, the whole thing, then be able to evaluate and weigh different perspectives and evidence and figure out what to do with those texts that represent that kind of array of voices in the conversation. But there are exceptions. Content farms. We're going to do some practice with these. And here's my thing with content farms. Content farms you will find, and there are fewer out there, but I still find every semester that there's always some that kind of weed their way into people's research and into people's projects. And it really is something to pay attention to. And again, they're mostly on like listen to me, they are part of the .com platform. One of the things that makes it tricky, because you have, a lot of really good sources on there, but then you have these sort of weeds choking all of the good stuff kind of out sometimes. So that it makes it really difficult to kind of sift through. And the thing with content farms is the goal where the content farm really is the money. They're trying to, it's quantity over quality. They are not trying to produce material that is valuable or new or accurate or in depth. They are just trying to spin out as many articles as possible, because those articles are going to have links. There are often going to be advertisements that take you to either other places on their platform, other articles, or back to places to sell you things, right? They're hiring a freelance writer that's making about $5 an article, and there's a formula. They're about 500 words, right? They have a little author bio. It's about 50 words. They're not always true. They're not always accurate. Here's my story. I used to write when I was in college for content farms as a freelance writer because I had bills to pay. Okay. It happens. College is hard. And so I did this. I have filled 50 article orders for $200. Think about that. And $5 an article. I want you to think about how hard you would work on an article for $5. And they're not asking for people to be experts in these issues. They're just asking for people that are pretty good writers that can pump out material really fast, right? I've written about that 50 article order that I filled was about herbs and oils, and I have literally zero expertise on that. I Googled and used other really bad sites to write my really bad article, and that's what a lot of this is. It's freelance writers using bad work from other freelance writers to write their bad material so it can flood the internet with something that is a page that mostly exists for advertisements. It's just decorated with words. Okay. So we're going to look at some examples of this, and here are some red flags, right? They are riddled with ads. We're going to talk about this design term later when we get to the digital essay, but I'm going to kind of talk about it now, and it's visual weight. It's when you're looking at a website, like if we looked at CNN, you have this ad up here, the fun like margarita ad, but you'll notice that most of the page, it clearly exists for the text. Clearly exists for the text. But you might have looked, sorry, my dog's barking in the background. But you might look at a website and notice that it pretty much just looks like it exists for the ads. Like there's way more focus on the ads than there is on the text. You even notice sometimes if you're, reading through these articles that the text is broken up by advertisement. So it's really hard to even tell like when the article starts and stops, and that's because it doesn't even matter. Because the point is for you to look at the ads. Not necessarily to have a really helpful, engaging, accurate article there, So the next thing is to look at these references. And I don't mean just looking at like the references list at the end. I also mean looking at the links like within the article, because a lot of times you'll notice that those links aren't actually to go to sources of information. They're either to go to articles like within the same platform, like Livestrong will send you to other Livestrong articles, Healthline will send you to other Healthline articles, eZine will send you to other eZine articles to keep you on that hamster wheel, reading things within the same platform, looking at their advertisements, or other kind of low quality sites, so content farms, like bad sites linking you to other bad sites. And ads often are the focus. When I was a freelance writer, like what you often get is a request for the content, and then also for the keywords and the links that they want you to send to include. So I don't remember what the keywords and the links were for this one, but I kept, so you have to be really careful. I kept or I did reviews on like the best places to go jogging around the country. And I don't know, I mean, you don't know much about me, but one thing I can tell you is that I don't run unless something is, you know, chasing me, something like that. But you can easily generate this kind of material by going to the pictures on the websites of the places and then writing an article about it. And the point not really being to be accurate about those places, but to include the links so people will go look at ads. And also, oh, I kept a mommy blog once. Like I have kids now, but I didn't then. But I kept a mommy blog about just all kinds of things. But the point wasn't like the mommy blog. The point was that I was supposed to work in links for Timberland boots. Let me tell you, that takes creativity. Just saying. You might also notice like really superficial information or like things that are just like straight opinion. Like you go through and you don't see a source or a piece of information inside. Like it's really just this person and their opinion about the information. Or it's superficial, like groundbreaking, like 3 ways to lose weight. Drink more water. Cut your calories. Exercise. Like stuff you would never guess in a million years. Sketchy author bios. A lot of times if you look at the author bio and it sounds vague or unverifiable, like is a prolific freelance writer who has written for many medical journals with no specific names, has a degree in such and such with no university name, so you can't check it, has won many awards that you can't Google, you know? So keeping it really vague, because those author bios a lot of times are usually about 50 words, and those little 50-word author bios often aren't even real. When I was a freelance writer, another fun story, I was told to flat out lie, like not to use my name. To make up a name and then add in some details that make it sound relevant to the article that I was writing. So you might often find that. So one of the things you really have to pay attention to is, and things that give it away are, they might say again, like paying attention to whether or not the thing they're saying they have a degree in is actually relevant. Like if they're writing about this thing, is their degree or expertise in this thing? Are they saying that they have won these awards or written these articles and it's specific information you can look it up, or is it that they have won lots of awards and have written for many many magazines and journals and it's really vague? So pay attention for things that are vague and sound sketchy and don't sound completely connected to the issue. Also, notably poor grammar and spelling, choppy sentence structure, because sometimes the article is not written by a person. You might have come across these articles before where you're thinking like, did they read this before and that's because a person didn't write it. You can actually have a program called that spins articles for you. And you can hire a person to do it. One of my favorite things to do as a freelance writer was to spin articles. And again, like I wouldn't do this now, but you know, I wasn't thinking about the ethics of it at the time. I was just thinking about, you know, paying bills. But it does give me some really good, like, experience to share with you now. But it was to spin articles where the company really doesn't want to write 5, you know, articles about this thing because they really don't care about putting the information out there. They just need content out on the internet with links so that people will buy things. Will click on those links, come back to their website and buy things. So they'll hire a writer and they'll give them 1 article, and that writer will turn that article into 10 articles that say all basically the same thing. Like you're just rewriting it 10 times so it passes Copyscape, so it doesn't get dinged for plagiarism. So they can publish like more content and, you know, do it fast. And so if you're reading articles and you're feeling, you know, you're kind of thinking, you know, this sounds like several other articles I've read, because it's probably like, it could be actually the same article. It is expensive to do that, so a lot of times they'll actually just put it through a spinner. Like you can actually just put the file into a spinner program and it'll just spit back those articles, and a program will do it, and that's why it'll have the notably poor grammar and spelling and choppy sentence structure and, you know, that kind of stuff. So these are your red flags that you want to pay attention to. So now that we have covered the crap test we'll be using this semester and started off with some introductory crappy stuff and some red flags for that, you're going to go on now and you're going to do your activity practicing recognizing these crappy content farms.